without further ado, Julia Steinberger.
Thanks so much, everybody. So I think maybe some context. So I come from natural sciences and I've sort of moved over into economic and social sciences and maybe more political aspects, which means that I've not been I don't come from a place where I'm used to studying political and economic forms. That's something I've sort of had to teach myself or be taught along the way. And so I've sort of been motivated by to do this by seeing how unseriously the economic sphere and the political sphere have been taking the work of my colleagues in the natural sciences. So I am not a climate scientist by training. I understand enough to understand a bit of what the climate science is doing. But what I certainly can see is that, you know, pretty much everybody can see at this point is that science is not being taken very seriously, and that has motivated me to learn about the economics and politics of what's going on around us. And I've sort of been learning into this space and learning about, for instance, the disinformation work of the fossil fuel industry, and then that motivated me to learn more about where did the fossil fuel industry start doing this disinformation? It turns out they've been doing it for over a century at this point. Like they're really, really good at it. And then I've also started learning more about current economic forms in terms of we're not just in capitalism, we're in neoliberalism and what that means. And I think maybe I'll just start the story with the Atlas Network. Maybe we'll just start there. So basically, neoliberalism is a political ideology. It's an economic and political ideology. It's not an economic theory. It's not academic per se. It's very much a worldview trying to impose itself on society. And that worldview has a few things in common. Um, it very much dislikes equality. It thinks that inequality and hierarchy are good foundations for society. It thinks that democracy is terrible because democracy comes with claims of equality. So they pretty much make the connection there. If you have a real democracy, you're going to have claims for equality, and that's going to make life for business owners very difficult. It doesn't like organized labor at all. It doesn't like claims for higher wages. And the problem is that this is a very unpopular agenda, and that the people advancing this agenda were extremely knew that it was unpopular in a democratic setting. However, they did have support from the very earliest days in terms of the International Chamber of Commerce. So definitely the business sphere was paying attention to them and liked them a lot. And eventually the fossil fuel industry liked them a lot. Um, so that was already starting in the 1920s in Vienna and in Geneva, as it turns out, around Ludwig von Mises and his colleagues, including somebody called Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek then starts taking these ideas forward in the post-war era, so after 1945, and then starts having some more success. I mean, there was a lot of failure going on as well, but they started having a bit more success and a bit more support. They formed the Atlas Network. No, they formed sorry, getting ahead of myself. They formed the Mont Pelerin Society, which is named, all of these places are really close to me. And I worked in Vienna, I'm from Geneva, and Mont Pelerin is just down the lake above the city of Vevey. Uh, it's a mountain. And they hung out on this mountain and they formed the society. They hung out in some very nice hotels. And they formed the Mont Pelerin Society. And they were really sort of trying to advance this ideology of neoliberalism. And it was unpopular, so it wasn't clear if it was going to be successful, but eventually it was. The first place it really had success and that they could take it forward was the Chile of Augusto Pinochet, so of dictator Pinochet. And Pinochet came in backed by the Americans. It was an American-backed coup, and he deposed and assassinated the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. The big crime of Allende was that he was going to nationalize the extractive industries of Chile, and that is not acceptable. Um, and so Chile basically kept capitalism going for the Americans and was able to impose a neoliberal economic order in Chile. The next place that neoliberalism came to the fore is actually the UK. But there it was elected. So basically, at the beginning of the 1970s, it was Pinochet and a dictatorship, which they're fine with. They don't like democracy at all anyway. And at the end of the 1970s, it was the election of Margaret Thatcher, thanks to the Institute of Economic Affairs think tank that was started by Anthony Fisher, who's a rogue chicken farmer, mega businessman. The story of Anthony Fisher and the rogue chicken farming is a whole great story, which maybe we will get to tonight. But anyway, the main thing he did is he started this think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs. And this Institute of Economic Affairs was very effective in disseminating neoliberal ideas and making them popular among certain classes of people and really sort of pushing them out into the public in a way that made them palatable. And they had two specific targets. They didn't target politicians directly, kind of interestingly, although they had some politicians being part of them. They targeted mainly editors and journalists. So they were basically pushing their materials out to the media to make their economic ideas palatable there. And they were targeting teachers and school curricula. So trying to get this version of economics, a very individualistic competition, maximal market freedom and profits is what allows us to have the best level of social welfare. These ideas, they were pushing them out into schools. And this is something, by the way, that the fossil fuel industry has done before that as well. Since the 1950s, the fossil fuel industry has been, in the US especially, has been influencing the school curriculum, the secondary school curriculum teaching of economics. So every single person who is alive today, basically in the US, has had that kind of economics training, including every politician and every voter. They very much saw themselves benefiting from capitalism and wanting people to believe that capitalism was the best economic system. And there's a whole bunch of studies and reporting that's been done on this, and it's super interesting. Anyway, Institute of Economic Affairs is so successful in getting Thatcher elected, and she really gives them credit for it. She says that you guys won this for us. That they basically start taking over the world. But so Anthony Fisher then develops the Atlas Network in the 1980s. The Atlas Network now has more than 500 members. We don't really know because they stopped sharing that information publicly when people started paying more attention to them around 2021. Desmog did a reporting on them, and since then that part of the website has been taken down and not updated. But fortunately, Desmog mirrored that they have the inventory at least at that time. So it's more than 500 think tanks around the world. Uh, the UK is definitely ground zero. The US is the next ground zero. There's tons of them in Latin America. There's quite a few in the rest of Europe. And Asia is quite covered as well. And what these think tanks do is they basically promote neoliberal economic ideas, and they do climate denial or climate delay. And so that's one of the things that was really interesting to me was to find out that this group of organizations that is has really been pushing these very detrimental free market, it's free, the market freedom that's promoted is the freedom for producers, right? Citizens do not get freedom in this situation. You don't get to choose the economic system that you want to live in. It's really for producers. And the Atlas Network is heavily funded by fossil fuel interests. And they've been running our world kind of in the open, just like people haven't been that interested in studying them as a thing since the 1980s. They've sort of taken over. And their ideas are so mainstream that, labor, Keir Starmer's labor is clearly, in terms of their economic thinking and their climate thinking, a product of this as well. So they've taken over good chunks of stuff that used to be called the left. And uh, they're doing this very sort of unequal predatory. They're putting forward this very unequal predatory economic system. They're extremely anti-democratic. They're definitely against scientific expertise and public interest expertise. That's one of the things they try to do is they try to that they're very effective at actually is they train these young people to sort of go and be pretty in front of televisions and spout their stuff. Um, and they're doing a lot of climate denial and climate delay. And so I've sort of been sleeping a lot less since I learned about them, and I've been trying to sort of tell people about them. I would say that the website and journalists at Desmog have been on this beat they've done tremendous work. So Desmog is definitely a great place to look for far more information. And maybe we can start the discussion now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. Yeah, the Atlas Network. I remember the first time I learned about that just being so it's mind-blowing, terrifying. But we'll start with a question that is, what do we promote, or what do we do, sorry, about the mainstream media promoting neoliberalism? So how do we combat that? It's a big one.
That's a big one. So I think one of the things to understand is that the Atlas Network and the think tanks organized in it, they've been very good at training people to be active in the media sphere. So a lot of the opinion columnists and even journalists um, in some of the most captured media, uh, but possibly even in others, might have gone through some of their summer schools. They call them freedom schools. In some cases, it's all kind of cultish. And so these people are sort of trained in these things without necessarily knowing who's behind it. Then, that it's the Koch brothers behind it or various other fossil fuel fortunes. So people a lot of people in the media domain are either friends with, or they're direct products of the Atlas Network, um, or are friends with people who are, or have just sort of gone through their training and not really realized what was going on. So I think one of the first things to do is to figure out, people have, is to sort of shine a spotlight on that and say, by the way, the media has some self-reflection to do. And this is something that has intensely frustrated me, is how much the UK media and the BBC is not very much including the BBC, refuses to do any kind of critical self-reflection and take themselves to task for having played the game of climate denial and climate delay and sort of the both siding, like let's keep the debate going. I mean, the BBC literally had guidelines saying that if somebody had to get a climate scientist on, you had to have one of these people who denies climate science or thinks it's fun to ask questions about it or whatever on as well. They had guidelines that said this. And even when those guidelines finally stopped, and I forget, it was a bunch, I think it was basically thanks to XR people finally saying, you know what, we're not playing this game anymore. We won't actually appear next to it. We won't share a platform with a climate denier, that the BBC finally revised this. Um, and even then, they kept inviting climate denial people on. So I think that shining a spotlight on who in the media has been part of this and getting them to think like, okay, what's our role in this? What have we done wrong? In the past, because we were part of it. We weren't just observers, we were actually part of the badness. So I think that basically having this sort of level of responsibility and seeing an active role in it is really important. And I would also ask people like, who's been through these programs? It's not like you're a bad person if you've been through this program. If you're a 25-year-old and you see this cool summer school, it's just sort of all expenses, 3 nights in a nice hotel, um, nice thing where you get to hang out with cool people and they say it's going to be good for your career, you might do that. That doesn't make you a bad person. However, as soon as you start reflecting on it, maybe you should start thinking, was that information neutral or not? There is no such thing as a free lunch. What came with that particular not free lunch? So I think that those are the kinds of things that we should be doing, is also trying to understand who in the media is strongly affiliated with the Atlas Network and start trying to get them to start making that more of an issue as well. The other thing to do would be to adopt some of the Atlas Network. I mean, we should be adopting some of their tactics. The we have this issue where like the far right, like Trump and Bannon, learned from the left and started adopting more shock tactics and doing more direct action and weird stuff like that. Um, but I think we could also learn from the Atlas Network. We could also ask to meet with newspapers, with journal editors, and sort of provide them with materials, provide them with expertise. In my university, we started doing this. We had a climate center that started doing some of this and having dialogues with media experts. And this is something that XR could do, is, put a bunch of scientists and a bunch of journalists in a room together, get to talk to each other, get to dialogue and stuff like that. And it was really interesting because they didn't know who to talk to necessarily. And it builds much more trust when you just go and talk to people. They're used to that. So I think that that's also a tactic that groups like movements like the climate movement and like XR could be doing, is going into the media and actually interacting with people directly and saying, hey, how can we put you in touch with the people who would actually have the information you need?
Yeah, I think that's also a good sort of lead into the next question that I'm seeing. That sorry, there's lots of questions coming in, trying to
Right.
sift through them all. But This question is, can we force rapid decarbonization under the current circumstances? Because it seems like tipping out neoliberalism as a prerequisite will surely take too long. It does feel like it's taken over in a way.
So I think that the problem is that neoliberalism and the fossil fuel industry are not different things. So I think that that's one of the things to understand is that when we're talking about rapid decarbonization, we're talking about taking down the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry has spent literally the last 100 years surrounding itself with a sort of armature of, on the one hand, a propaganda wing, which is the public relations industry. And they grew up at the same time as the public relations industry. Like literally, the public relations industry pioneers started out working for the fossil fuel industry. Anybody who's heard of the Rockefeller, if you hear the word Rockefeller, what does it make you think of? It might make you think of a place and a building in New York City. It might make you think of the Rockefeller Foundation that funds great things like the Lancet Planetary Health, and it's like I think they started the Planetary Health, which is a great thing on climate, including on climate, or they fund good stuff. And why did the Rockefeller Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation exist? It exists because of the Ludlow Mine Massacre, which was the head of Standard Oil, Mr. Rockefeller, killed a bunch of miners and their families because he put down a strike, and a public relations guru started basically gave him the advice to start this foundation, and that's remembered, and Ludlow isn't. So I think that it's not so easy to get rid of the. So the fossil fuel industry has an armature of the public relations industry, and they have an armature of an economic system where they've sort of given themselves economic and political allies that fit their business model very well. And that's what neoliberalism is. So the apparatus, the propaganda apparatus, and the economic apparatus of neoliberalism are very much connected to the fossil fuel industry. And I think that taking on both certainly weakens them. So I think we get faster decarbonization if we expose neoliberalism for what it is, which is sort of the economic system that the fossil fuel industry loves most.
There was a question as in, should we ever trust economists, and are there economists that we can look to that are more radical economists or economists that you'd recommend sort of looking to?
Yeah, not all economists, right? Um,
Yeah.
but most, 99%. No, so
Yeah.
so I think there are sort of okay, I don't know how to say this. Most of mainstream economics is not great
Mm.
in the sense that it has adopted certain tenets or certain ways of seeing the world that are not helpful at the current point in time. They see the world as a place where you have equilibrium, like market equilibrium. So they have these sort of idealized visions of the world around perfect markets, smooth processes, smooth transitions. Everything is sort of optimal. And that's just not the world we're in right now. So it's sort of a badly adapted way of seeing the world for a time of crisis. That's just sort of a general thing. Um, the science of economics has also stayed away from looking at power relations. Because, of course, if you start looking at power relations, you start looking at ownership. If you start looking at ownership, you start looking at exploitation. If you start looking at exploitation, inevitably you will become, some kind of a dirty socialist hippie. And that's not something that's good for their jobs. So they've been staying away from that. And so that just makes them sort of unuseful. But then there's also there's a corner of the economists that have been sort of more actively detrimental. And I would say that the kinds of economists that you can definitely count on are sort of outside the main camp. So the ones you can definitely count on are anybody who's doing ecological economics, anybody who's doing degrowth or post-growth. You can probably trust them because they are very far from the main city of the main economists. They're very much in the sort of renegade village on the far outskirts. And but even within mainstream economics, there'll be quite a few people at this point who want to really do work and help out. It's it's just that it's probably a longer distance for them to sort of state things clearly in terms of the need to destroy certain industries that are very mega right now.
Sure. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, I think we'll take one or maybe two more questions before we move on. But This is a really interesting one. How will the neoliberal system sustain itself, or will it sustain itself as climate impacts worsen? Isn't it
Oh, it's
bound to collapse?
this is the worst part is that they have been planning for this for 50
Mm,
years.
mhm,
Like the fossil fuel industry has known what their products do to the planet and to societies since so we know that they were that the American Petroleum Institute was warned in the late 50s that climate change exists and that they were contributing to it. They were given chapter and verse by Edward Teller already in the late 50s, and they took him seriously. And so they've been doing their own climate science and they know exactly what's going on. They had better, so Jeffrey Supran and colleagues have shown in 2023, a beautiful paper that came out in, I forget what journal, but it was beautiful, possibly one of the Nature ones, that the fossil fuel and Exxon in particular had better climate models than the IPCC did up until the
mhm,
90s, the sometime in the 90s. Anyway, so they knew exactly what they were doing, and they've been planning for that. And so what happens with neoliberalism under climate impacts is basically capitalism no longer makes as much profits from production as it does from constraining consumption and limiting basically things like privatization, sort of limiting the ways that you can gain basic services. And so what they're doing is they're making lots of money off of poorer people. And you can see sort of the middle class shrinking and poor people not doing so well as a result of this. So it's constraining things like healthcare. It's constraining things like access to housing, access to public transportation. Um, so all of these things, and also making money off of security. So there are all these industries involving like repression, security, private security firms, um, so as things collapse, as there's impacts, for instance, in the US, you see now that there's private firefighters, right? If you're in
mm,
California and you don't want your neighborhood to burn, you hire private firefighters. So you basically have this whole privatization of the essentials of life, and then people are sort of forced to pay or go under. And the more fragmented, unequal, divided, polarized, and vulnerable people are, the more they're going to be able to squeezed by this economic system. It basically squeezes everything. It just takes everything, whether it's healthcare or education or food or water. Like there's all these plans for like water shortages because they're going to be making so much profits from that. It's really unfortunate. So this
mhm,
economic system, I would say, is very well poised to make lots of profits from despair and destruction. And
mhm.
Naomi Klein has been talking about this for a while under the term disaster capitalism. So this is very much of a piece, sadly.
Yeah. Oh God, it's so terrifying. I think we're gonna have to end on that note, but thank you for all of your questions. We got tons of them, and really sorry if we didn't get to yours. There was just so many amazing questions. Um, but thank you, Julia. I feel like I could hear you listen to you speak for ages. That was incredible.